Welcome to Arcane Crime, a world-building project set in a modern America where society runs on magic rather than science and technology. This video goes over how I design the magical creatures of this world by looking at my centaur concepts as a case study, as well as the lore surrounding them. I'm currently working on a detective novel set in this world, and I included a short excerpt from the book that introduces my centaur to the story. That'll be at the end of this video, so stick around. That scene packs a punch. Before I dive in, I just want to go over a quick disclaimer. I am a writer, not a concept artist. I actually only learned to draw a couple of months ago. Since I am a writer first, you may notice as I go through my ideas that my design focus is much heavier on the logical consistencies within my world rather than the physical appearance. With that said, let's get started. When I started this project, my goal was to give the world a sense of gritty realism in the tradition of some of my favorite films like Seven, Heat, and The Godfather, while also maintaining that wonder that is so endearing about classical fantasy. An area where these two ideals came into conflict was with magical animals. My world concept of magic replacing technology, at least on the surface, doesn't seem to allow the existence of something like a centaur. My world's history is identical to our own until the mid-1600s when magic was first invented. And since centaurs have never existed in our world, how could they exist in the world of arcane crime? On the other hand, if I abandoned having magical creatures altogether, my world began to feel very stale and lifeless to me. So the inevitable compromise I had to make was, if I was going to include centaurs, they had to be man-made. The only question then was how. The first idea I toyed with was playing with a high-tech, multi-dimensional concept. Perhaps magicians created a spell that allowed you to open portals to other worlds, and one of these worlds just happened to be populated with traditional magical centaurs. I thought this was really cool for a while, but then realized it was basically the Chronicles of Narnia written by Marvel Comics. That, and with all of the multiverse movies that have come out recently, I realized that this idea wasn't unique at all, and I also developed a multiverse fatigue. The second idea I had comes from a bit of local history. I live in Utah in the United States, and in the years following World War II, the US government tested a lot of nuclear weapons in Nevada. For those unfamiliar with the area, Nevada is right next to Utah, and because of the wind currents, a lot of toxic exhaust from these tests blew directly into the Utah town St. George. Fast forward a few years, and a ton of people from that town were diagnosed with a wide variety of rare cancers. Those affected call themselves downwinders. So what does this little piece of trivia have to do with centaurs? Well, what if magicians working for the federal government accidentally spilled a toxic potion that got into the atmosphere? And what if the toxins from this potion had caused people and animals to slowly morph into the fantastical? While I liked this idea a lot, a centaur created from this backstory looked a bit too much like something from The Walking Dead. It was a cool concept, but it didn't feel cohesive with the story I'm trying to tell. It would be like Sherlock Holmes having to fight off a zombie horde before revealing who the murderer is. It just didn't seem to fit in any practical way. I still liked this idea a lot, and I tried to modify it to feel a bit more controlled. The alternative I came up with was, what if instead of the government developing a chemical weapon, what if it was a super soldier program? I pictured the centaurs being developed in test tubes genetically enhanced for warfare, kind of like an urban fantasy equivalent of Saruman making the Uruk-hai. I also really liked this idea, but it still didn't quite fit, mostly because my novel is set in the modern day. That's a problem because guns became way more accurate during the American Civil War in the 1860s. Any story set later than that time, and centaurs wouldn't be very effective for the military. Since centaurs are so big, they would just be an easier target to shoot, so the government wouldn't think to use them as super soldiers. The idea I eventually settled on was inspired by the combination of a story I heard while visiting Edinburgh, Scotland back in 2019, and a personal experience I had about a year ago. While visiting Scotland, I came across a small museum on the Royal Mile, which is a popular shopping area in downtown Edinburgh, and a tour guide there told me the story of two grave robbers who would sell dead bodies to the local medical school. Local laws at the time made it difficult for schools to provide enough cadavers to train their doctors, so they turned to illegal methods to get what they needed. Fast forward to roughly a year ago, and a close family member of mine needed to have surgery. It was a minor surgery, so I wasn't afraid they would die or anything, but seeing someone I cared about going through such a painful procedure and recovery was deeply unsettling to me. So when I was facing this creative problem, trying to come up with a criminal centaur concept, I realized that if I wanted this centaur to be as horrifying to my readers as it was to myself, I needed to make it as personal as possible. The centaur, the surgery, the grave robbers, and shady doctors all blended together in the dark caves of my imagination, and what eventually came out was a question. What if centaurs could only be created through magically enhanced surgery? This concept of a Frankenstein centaur turned out to be the perfect mix of both grounded and fantastical that I was looking for. Fantastical because it allowed centaurs to logically exist in my world, but grounded because it's something that isn't that far from what's possible and also very similar to things that people have actually done historically. Also, since the creation of the centaur is a very visceral process, creating a tragic backstory that naturally led centaurs to a life of crime was very easy to come up with. Here's what happened to my centaurs. The history of interspecies surgery is a hellish road paved with good intentions. In the late 19th century, a magic spell was invented by doctors in Boston that allowed a person's limb to continue to function normally after being amputated from the body. The spell was invented to allow surgeons to graft new limbs onto amputees who had lost an arm or a leg. However, while this spell worked effectively between animals, it proved ineffective between humans. As soon as a new limb was sewn onto a different human body, the limb would rapidly atrophy and die. Despite these early failures, the surgeons of that era were not deterred, and since they had been successful with animal test subjects, they soon attempted to mix animals and humans together. To everyone's great surprise, this radical experiment worked. The first limb replacement that succeeded was a man who had been given an arm from a gorilla. Although initially popular among amputees and people born without all their limbs, people who underwent this procedure faced a tremendous amount of bigotry, often becoming ostracized from their families and communities and were seen as less than human. Because of the animosity against the man-beasts, as they were cruelly nicknamed, in 1903 the American federal government passed the Beast Act, which banned interspecies surgery. Rather than stopping the practice, this law poured a fortune into the hands of gangs and cartels. These groups soon found doctors with low morals and high medical school debt, and hired them to make creatures from myths and fairy tales to sell for profit. Once sold, the man-beasts would be used for anything from prostitution to illegal fighting rings. They even appear occasionally in edgy off-Broadway plays. This practice of mutilating and selling these individuals is known as beast trafficking. Today, beast trafficking is rampant in most major American cities and is also found worldwide. One of the illegal beast fights these poor souls are used for is depicted early on in my novel. In the following scene, a character named Dr. Gold encounters two man-beasts for the first time. Now, as a quick side note, you may have noticed that the man half of this centaur is a little smaller and higher up on the horse than is usually depicted. This is because horses are bigger than most people expect. To make traditional centaurs work, the human torso actually has to be enlarged, or the horse has to be made smaller to look proportional. Since my centaur is a regular person and a regular horse sewn together, the proportions would actually look a little off as they do in this illustration. Anyway, here's the account of the fight as witnessed by Dr. Gold. The surgeon's work had recreated beasts from ancient myths and fairy tales. The first man had once been a bodybuilder. Now that his torso had been sewn onto the powerful shoulders of a stallion, he had become an artificial centaur. The work on the other man came from Egyptian tradition. Symbolizing the ancient god Anubis, a jackal's face had been pasted onto the man's head as a permanent mask. Long black claws enhanced his hands and feet, and the surgeons had even given him a tail. Though also well-muscled, the man-jackal had a lean build designed for speed rather than power. Both creatures fought to their strengths. The centaur punched and stomped at the man-jackal with great force. The lithe man-jackal dodged about him this way and that, avoiding the strikes with relative ease, and snaking in rapid slashes wherever it saw an opening. The centaur was already bleeding from many long cuts across its chest, arms, and gut. The man-jackal, on the other hand, had breathed heavily from exertion, but suffered from little more than light bruising. Clustered around the cage, a crowd heckled and jeered, slammed their open palms against the bars, and cried out in bloodlust. The crowd soon got what they wished for. As Dr. Gold reached the cage, the centaur shot his hand out with unexpected speed and grabbed the man-jackal by the tail. The man-jackal clawed at the centaur's face. The centaur screamed. The man-jackal had gotten a claw in its mouth and tore open its cheek. The centaur, recoiling in agony, now wore an unnaturally wide, grisly smile, but he still held the man-jackal by its tail. With the ease of picking up a toy, the centaur yanked the man-jackal's entire body up into the air. For the merest second, the man-jackal gave the illusion that it was levitating. Then, with the speed of a howling wind, the centaur slammed it face first to the floor. Dr. Gold felt, more than heard, the crack of its skull hitting the solid concrete. Before the man-jackal could recover, the centaur stampeded, systematically trampling it. In seconds, the man-jackal's head was smashed to pieces. Spattered across the octagon floor, the remains were not unlike a smashed watermelon, if a watermelon were made of fur, teeth, eyeballs, and screams. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please leave a comment and I'll answer it as soon as I can. See you all next time.